I'm going to take one of these and do a demo with it. So I'm going to be doing a demo on my computer. Let's do one that we haven't seen much of. I think we're going to go ahead and do this one. This is a super famous painting. We'll go ahead and do this one. Guys, I want you to know that widely, this is considered the first Cubist painting of all time. And it's because the space at the front of this makes little to no sense. This area right here, if you actually look at the rules of perspective, none of what is going on in the shape of the table here and the way this is perched on top of it and falling off actually makes sense in terms of space. And so a lot of people will cite this as the first painting that is erring towards actual cubism, pre-Picasso, because Picasso is frequently credited for, being the cubist guy. There were plenty of people doing it beforehand, especially like the Italian and the Russian futurists, and he just kind of stole from other people. Actually, he has an amazing quote, and this really is a Picasso quote, and it basically says, like, if you're gonna steal, know how to hide your sources. And he's like the ultimate person for that. Actually, my ex-husband, there was a very funny moment in an art gallery with him where we were looking through an early 1900s, actually, I think it was early 1900s Russian futurism. It was just a teeny little exhibit in LACMA. And we're walking through, and all of a sudden, Jason's like looking at stuff, and he's like, wait a minute, this looks a lot like stuff Picasso did like 20 years later. I'm like, yeah, he just stole from other people. He just knew how to hide his sources. And he's walking around, and his mind was blown. It was so funny because all of, like, when you know enough art history, that starts to be like, we all know Picasso just kind of took some trends from other people and like elaborated upon them because he was actually an extremely gifted technician in terms of art. But fun fact, he just really stole from Russian futurism. And yet is credited as, actually, he was probably one of the most famous living artists in his lifetime, I think even to this day. By the end of his life, fun fact about Picasso, he never paid for anything because he would write checks, and he was aware that no one would ever cash the check because his signature was worth more than whatever he was paying for. So Picasso literally didn't pay for anything at the end of his life. He just wrote checks, and people kept the checks and framed them and never cashed them. So Picasso is not one of my favorite people. He is not one of my favorite artists, but there are lots of very funny facts about him in terms of like how he lived his life. I mean, he was also a notorious womanizer, but like everybody back then. I don't know. Most famous painters have that in there. That's a whole big topic for another day. But like, yes, it's probably not the. All right, let's see. I know it's in my downloads. There it is. Okay. So I am going to show you guys what you are going to do once you've chosen an image. So this is, you have now finished your pen tests. You've finished your pattern tests. You've selected a painting. So once all of those are done, and I've approved your selected painting. Once all of those are done, you are going to print out your painting. So I know I am doing this on a screen, and that is going to be a little bit of a different experience. That is because you would not be able to see me doing this if I just did this in a physical demo. You actually need to see what I am doing because I've shown you a physical example of what one of these looks like. So like I said before, if we look at Eric's from a couple of years ago, he has outlined the shadows, the masses, and the highlights in order to define the image. But I understand that that might not necessarily be the most obvious thing to many of you. So you will be doing this on a physical printout. You will not be doing this in Photoshop like I am doing. But I would like you to actually see how I'm going to break apart an image. Usually I would just do this in class and actually like hand around the thing that I did, but clearly not going to happen. Any questions? I know I'm covering a lot today, guys.
So we're basically like, after we choose our painting, like we just like basically print it out and then like do the next
Yep.
step.
And I'm going to show you what you guys are going to do next. And anytime I open Photoshop, guys, welcome to pictures of my dog in costumes. Let's see. I didn't want that over there. Okay, create new. Let's just do that one and I'll cut it down. All right. All right, pause is on. Open. Yay. Command A. Guys, do you all know keyboard commands, by the way?
Nope.
No?
Like most of them, I think. Like the ones that I actually need.
Well, like Command A, Command C, Command V, Command P. You guys know all of those?
Yeah.
What's Command A? Oh,
Command A
highlight
is
it.
select all. If you ever get into Photoshop, Command Z is undo. And it's very important. But yeah, always keyboard commands are a really big deal because I'm always surprised when people don't know them. Like, yes, I'm fine putting this into an RGB workspace. Okay, so here is my Cezanne painting. So I would have printed this out, and first things first here, I am going to switch this to grayscale because I am asking you guys to print this out in grayscale. So, oh shit, where is it? Let's see.
Oh, so we print it out in black and white.
It's going to make your life a lot easier. It is much, much easier to see. It's much, much easier to see value in gray. So partially because some of this is that working. So, and this is something that's come up multiple times with working with men in general. Frequently, you'll find someone who is a little bit colorblind. And color can be a distractor in this. So it is a little easier if you print it out in black and white. But I mean, because more often than not, I think I've had at least one colorblind student every year or some differing level of colorblindness. But so for instance, if you look at this, like one of you might, like we might read, say this yellow right here as being a different value than this yellow right here. And that's because this yellow is next to red and this yellow is next to green, and it changes our perception of the things. But if we go in and actually black and white it, so I'm going to go back and go ahead and desaturate it one more time. So there's my desaturated version. And you see that this yellow and this yellow are actually the same value. And so it makes breaking these down into pieces quite a bit simpler. So I'm going to go ahead and select my paintbrush here. And I apologize because I am doing this with a mouse, that it's going to be a little bit, it's not going to be perfect here. And I am going to zoom in a little bit. Let's see, hard pressure round, hardness and directional stroke. Okay, we're good. Okay, so for instance, let's go ahead and start in here since it doesn't matter where you start on this, but we are going to start outlining the values. So this is something you will be using your extra fine point Sharpie for. So the teeny weeny Sharpie. And remember, the reason I am saying you're using your Sharpie is because you can check on the back by flipping it over and making sure you got all the lines. Sharpie bleed through is very, very helpful. In this case, I'm obviously going to be working in this document, so I'm not going to be able to do that. But I'm going to start with this value right here. So I'm actually going to use that yellow that I was talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this whole little section right here belongs to that one value. And then if I'm breaking apart this little apple right here, this section is a second value. That section is a third value. And then this part, yeah, I know there's a little more apple down there because, I mean, I can do the math on the size of an apple. Like I know that apples are round, right? But I really can't see in there. So that's going to be a whole differing value set down here. So I'm going to move on to the apple next door. So this apple has a very bright section in it right here. And then a slightly lighter one or slightly darker one right there, and then the little edge right there. Now, this apple has less, so I'm going to go ahead and circle the highlight. There is a shadow right there. And then it looks like most of the rest of this mass is going to stay the same color. Same here. So I'm just going to go through these so you can see that I'm basically pulling out the highlighted area. And I'm saying, okay, well, there's the highlight on the apple. There's the mid-tone, right? So it's a middle gray. And then there's what's called the shadow or the low lights. So in terms of low lights, you actually can make some decisions here, which is that like an area in here is about the same value as this area down here, is also the same value that sits between the apples here. So you're going to find that I'm going to end up with a large dark section in here that's all kind of one color. And I promise that if you break this down and just kind of take your time putting this map together, you're actually going to end up with something that will always resemble the painting when it comes out. So let's go ahead and cover this apple here because this one's really specific. So there is that color, there's this little tiny light spot on it, and then there's this dark shadow area over here that sits like that. This I'm going to say is just one little colored lump, which is fine. There's a light spot right there and a slightly darker mid-tone right there. Same goes for this guy here. And you'll notice that some of these are more detailed than others, and it typically has to do with where they sit in the painting. So this apple, we can go ahead and outline here. But you see down here, I'm going to just say, okay, well, that shadow ends right there. There's a little black dot right there. And then there's this nice little light section right in there. But now you notice that all this dark area in here is all going to be one large mass because we can't see what's going on in there. It's the way it was painted. And that's part of the reason that I do this in black and white, is that it's much simpler to see all of these little gyrations in color difference without actually dealing with it being color. All you are doing is looking for where the value changes. So value refers to whether or not something is light or dark. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off this fruit basket here. Any questions for me as I'm doing this? Everyone kind of see what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
All right, and this little guy over here is pretty much all one color, so we can just leave it that way. This one has this nice little dark section at the back. And one right there. Little top piece right here. I apologize for the pixelization, guys. That's really because I'm zooming in on this on Photoshop in order to make my mouse lines look more accurate than they are. But now you see, I can't see a lot of the content that's around that, so I'm not going to do anything with it. You don't need to add things where things aren't. Like usually painters have made choices in order to pare down things so that they make sense visually. So usually if it's not there, chances are is not important. Okay, and this guy's got a big light section right in there. There's this funky little lump, and I don't know what it is, but it's going to get outlined because it needs to be outlined. All right, this one has that little divot right there. And there's a little bit of a value shift down the middle. And then we've got these little dudes in the back, which we really can't see because the painter hasn't intended us to be able to see much of the detail in it. There is a light section on one edge. Same goes for this little guy right here. Okay, so that is my fruit outlined in that basket. So I've gone through and basically I have highlighted. So what I've done is I've drawn a line around highlights, so light spots, low lights, which are shadows, and then mass. So masses are anything that takes up space, right? Like we all have mass. We all know what mass is from physics. But when we talk about masses in paintings, it's like any of these would be an individual mass. They are a shape, they have a volume, they are three-dimensional, and we need to acknowledge them as such. So now if we're going to go ahead and do the basket that these guys sit in, I'm going to go ahead and say that this little area right here is going to get outlined because that's the inside part of the handle. The outside shape is clearly going to get outlined the whole way around. And I still can see the difference in there, even though it's very, very faint between those two things, but there is a dividing line. And I will drop my back layer on this at some point, guys, so you can see it. So I go ahead and I got the outline of the basket, but now there's a light section on the top of the basket right in here, where you can see this right little area right in here is just slightly lighter than the rest of the black, and it gives it volume. So that's when we're talking about the idea of mass being important here. There is a highlight right in this bottom part that comes up to the edge of the basket. There's one that's right in here as well. But you notice in here, we do have this one little line that gives us just a slight difference in the edge of the basket on that one side, but the rest of this is basically going to be black, and it is okay if that gets filled in with black. That doesn't matter. So a whole amount of this background will become just a black mass at the end, or you can decide that, say, you want certain types of masses in your drawing to all be the same pattern. So this is when you begin to make decisions for these things. So I'm going to drop my back layer here. I'm just going to hide it. Or let's see. Oh, damn it. All right. My background layer isn't going to do that. I drew on top of the layer. Shit. Let's see. I think I can clone it. I can. Okay. I don't know. I will just start a new layer and I'll do another section on it. Okay, so it's most of your painting is going to look like this. Oh, I missed a spot. There is a nice light spot right in there. So if you see that when I went into this, God damn it, I literally shared a meme with my friend about drawing on your sketch layers last night, and I just drew on my sketch layer. Sorry, it's a Photoshop joke, but still, it's such a kick in the face. Okay, so I have my little outline there. So if I were to make some decisions about how I were to fill this in, if I was actually, once this was transferred onto another page, I might decide that all of my highlights, so these areas here, because these are all right about the same value. So all of my highlights, I might decide that they're all going to be the same pattern. Maybe they're all going to be dots. And maybe all of my lowlights, so my midtones, these guys here, maybe all of those are stripes. And maybe all of my black areas aren't black. Maybe they're a really dense houndstooth, or maybe so density matters to the pattern you use. So for instance, in a shadow area, chances are you're going to want to use a pattern that is heavier than others. But and chances are in a lighter area, you want to use a less dense pattern. But those choices are up to you. You can reverse them, and I have had people reverse them over the years. But for instance, in something like this, you can tell that the things that are closer to forward are the things that are lighter instead of darker, which does create an illusion of depth. So I'm going to create myself a new layer here. So new layer. All right. Yeah, layer 2. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and work on a little bit of this part down here. So this is the little tablecloth. So same thing, we're going to go through and outline our highlights first and our shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, that's a different section. That's a different color. Okay, and I've got a little apple right here. So I'm going to go ahead and outline the apple. And then the apple's little highlight right here. A lot of this is white. If I were actually using this painting, and I am purposely using this painting because no one is using this painting in this class. Most people actually don't like this painting. It's good for breaking this stuff up, but it is not my favorite Cezanne. But like this orange right here, that orange is one value. There is no highlight on that orange. But this little area here, which is that nice little chunky shadow, is a different color than this little nice little chunky shadow, is a different value than this chunky shadow over here. So you want to be as specific as possible with what you are outlining on here, because it is what will project what the painting is supposed to be. Okay, so if I were to go ahead and drop my values in here, so I'm going to put two more little marks in here. So that guy there and this little bend here. And so this is just folds in fabric, but keep in mind when fabric folds, it does tend to take on some right angles, especially stuff like napkins. Okay, so there's my little value map for those guys. So that's my little area in there. So now if I go ahead and hide my other two layers, you can see what this looks like as just a map of space. Obviously, it needs other stuff connected to it, but you can see basically what I am outlining. And so this, this is the orange here. Here are my shadows. Here are my highlights in this. So if I add that back in, you can see what that becomes and you can actually check it, which is why we do the thing with the bleed through on the paper. It's basically my version of being able to hide my drawing layer, just in real life. So once you guys have done your pen tests, your pattern tests, and turned those in, once you've chosen your painting, you are going to be able to print your painting out. I will be sending you, once everyone is finalized on their images, I will be sending you a large size file of the painting you chose. I think you can also pull them out of my Google Doc. I believe you can download them if you want to get started earlier. Most of those are good size. I think there are one or two that might be a little smaller, and I'll send you a different file. But I will be emailing you guys your actual full size file. Any questions for me about how we're going to go about doing this?
So we basically just print it out and like highlight all this, like the shadows and stuff.
Yeah, so it's highlights, shadows, and masses. And the thing is, though, the more detailed you are with this, the better this looks. As a point of comparison, so I'm gonna hold up Eric's again. You see how detailed all of the different areas are that he went over in this, which really do make up so much of how complicated this painting actually is, right? That translates when you put it into the drawing. So for instance, I have one in here that isn't as well traced. So for instance, this is not as well traced as Eric's was, or actually many of the other projects I have here. It did come out nicely, but this person did not pay as much attention to detail. And yes, it's complete and they did do well on it. It's a pretty good piece. They actually really brought it back and put in a decent amount of work. But at the same time, if we look at that in comparison to, say, Luke's Frida's, when you look at this, the amount of detail really pays off. But even in these little spots down here where he has the same pattern with dark and light highlights in it, or areas where he's switched patterning on the types of skin according to what person it is, or different level, like where the skirts were the most like the darkest parts of them, and then you add more pattern accordingly in there. So the more detailed this first step is, the better the second half comes out. Download it out of that presentation if you want to get started on this a little earlier, but I'm going to use this one here as an example. So if I were going to go print this, I would go to print through preview, and you want to print this in black and white, and you want to scale to fit. So right here, scale to fit, print entire image. And in this case, I would also change it to being black and white. But I'm not going to print this because I need to do this on a computer. I've been trying to figure out how to do this demo for you guys and make it make sense. So it means I'm going to do this in Photoshop. But if you were printing this, you want to scale to fit, print entire image. And you also then want to make sure that it is being printed in black and white. So I'm going to go ahead and take my image here and put it into Photoshop. So you guys are going to get to see what I'm going to do with this in Photoshop. Yeah, I can put it into this RGB space. All right. Okay. So here's the one that I'm going to use. I'm actually going to make sure I do something I didn't do last period because I'm silly. I am going to actually do this drawing on a totally new layer so I can actually show you the differences between these as we do this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start layer 2 here. Okay, so there is my painting that I'm using. So like I said, we are going to be outlining our painting in shadows, masses, and highlights. And in this case, the reason you will be using an extra fine point Sharpie for this in your case. So see, this is printed in black and white. He outlined in a black fine point Sharpie, and it shows right through the page so you can check if you've actually missed anything or not. In this case, I'm going to be able to turn my layers on and off so you can actually see that same process. So I will tell you that the more detailed you are about this step, the better your piece is going to come out. So as an example, this one did come out pretty well. This is one that's done on the persistence of memory, but you can see in here that a lot of the tracing is kind of chunky. Like there isn't a ton of attention to detail in different levels of shadows and masks. Where if you were to look at, say, this one done of the two Fridas, there's tons of detail put into each of the shadow areas and the mass areas. And then that opened up, and this person clearly thought about what pattern was going where and why. But I will tell you that the more detailed and the better your initial tracing is, the better off your piece will end up at the end. So I really recommend taking your time on this step. I mean, this one's really intense, but I mean, his tracing is absolutely stunning. So it does matter. Like, don't rush through this process. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and zoom in here. And first things first, I am going to black and white this. And so I bet you're all wondering, like, why is she telling us to print this in black and white if we all have color printers? And it's because we are dealing with something called value here. Now, value is how light or dark something is. So in this case, if we are looking in, say, our apples right here, this yellow and this yellow are the same yellow. But in context of this being in color, this yellow looks brighter than this yellow because this yellow is next to lighter colors and actually is more contrasted by a dark color here than the green one is as well. So there are lots of things about color that can actually be super deceptive to what you see. So in this case, I am going to go ahead and go up to image, and I'm going to go ahead and go to my adjustments, and I'm going to desaturate it. Oh, I'm in the wrong layer, sorry. Oops. We'll go back to my layer 1 and I'll desaturate layer 1. All right, image, no, undo, I hit the wrong button. Image, adjustments, desaturate. Okay, so there is a black and white image. So you notice how much clearer that is to see. First of all, it is so much easier to tell what thing is actually like another thing. Like when I'm looking at this now, I can see that this spot here, 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 and here, and here, and here are all the same color because they're all the same value. They're all the same level of gray. So when we talk about value, we're really talking about how saturated or desaturated a color is.
Grau.
Yes, dear.
It's kind of hard to see. Could you zoom in a little bit? Just because it's like a gray mouse on a gray background.
Oh yeah, I know, and it's got this stupid little circle. You're gonna see when I do a lot of it. I'm gonna draw on this, Spence.
Okay, cool. It's just kind of hard to see, that's all.
Okay, so I am gonna go ahead and zoom way in here. And we are going to go to the fruit basket. That's where we're gonna start. Would you guys like me to use a brighter ink color so you can see it?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go ahead and use a nice pumpkin orange. All right, so I'm going to start with my light areas. The area that I was talking about, so this little spot here on the top of this guy, I'm going to go ahead and outline my highlight. So there's the highlight on that apple. And there's the highlight on that. So I'm going to go ahead and go through these and just circle the highlights. So you notice I'm doing this with a mouse. If I was doing this with a pen, this would be a lot more painstaking. But I'm going through and I am just circling the areas as detailed as possible. So not just drawing a circle around them, but actually outlining the detailed edge of each highlight area on each piece of fruit. You don't necessarily need to do this in the order I'm going to do this. I just find it's simple for showing how to do something. Okay, and there's another highlight area. Got another one over here. And another one here. Okay, and that looks like that's all of those are about the same value, which is what I want. So I circled my highlights with those. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch my color here, and I'm going to go ahead and outline my lowlights. So when I say lowlights are shadows. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and outline this giant shadow that's actually between all of the fruit. And that's part of the reason that not everything in here looks perfectly round, is because in fact, there's a lot of the shadow area where we aren't going to be able to see the detail. So you can see even when I come up in the division between fruits, this is basically one large black area that's going to sit around it. And I'd say it continues right in down here. And right there. It continues right over here. All right, there's another dark area. There's another little one right over here. So you can see how a lot of this stuff, while when we're looking at a value set here, a lot of what becomes a dark on here will actually merge with other objects, because in fact, painters do know when they do these things that there is some simplification that's going to happen in terms of shapes and shadows. Like they're just giving you enough information, and it depends obviously whether or not what type of painting movement the painting you're using is from. Obviously the Renaissance is a little more clear than say an Impressionist like Mr. Cezanne here. But what you do start to see is that there are areas where you're not going to be able to see the detail, and I don't want you to invent it. The detail isn't there because it's like a black and white photograph with a black area in it. Like we can't see what's going on there because it's dark. It's that simple. So there is another dark area that's outlined. The edge of this basket is going to count into that. And you actually can see the difference between the wine bottle and the basket. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that outline right down there. And I'd say that it's pretty much ending right about there. So now I'm going to come over to this side here and finish up my dark areas. And then I'll go in and pick out some other values in the basket and in the apples. Okay, there's that little nubbin right there. All right, there's this little thing, which is the inside circle there. And get this guy. Okay, we're going to come down to the edge here. We've got the handle of the basket here. I apologize, my lines would be a lot cleaner if I were doing this in person. Like I said, I am doing this on a trackpad, so I'm doing pretty damn good for a trackpad. But now you see, as I started to outline that, you're going to get some spaces in here that are actually different values. So as I complete these outlines, you'll see that, for instance, I'll go ahead and switch my color here again. You'll see that this area here, for instance, is a different value than this area over here. And that's just become clear as I started outlining these things. It is a single image. You are going to start running into your marks. I'll go ahead and use that color as my next outline color. So now I'm going to come in and pick out some of the midtones. So we have our lowlights, which are our shadows. We have our highlights, which are our lightest spots. And then we also are going to have some midtones in here. So we do have a little line that runs along this edge right there. Here's another one right here. There's another midtone down here. And that kind of is a little lump that's right there. There's one right here. There's a nice little division in here that's a midtone. You get another one right in there. You get one on the edge of this guy here that actually goes into the majority of that apple. There's one right here on this apple. So now you've got your midtones in there as well. So we're then going to go in and go ahead and do the same thing in the body of this basket down here. So we don't really have any highlights in this part of the basket. So I'm going to stay in this color. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight our midtone there. Circle the edge of the midtone there. And I'm going to come back in with the purple color I had or something close to it. Let's try there. And it's a little redder, but whatevs. And finish off the bottom edge of the basket here, which comes up right like that to the edge of that little piece of fruit. But now you'll see right here, there is a shadow. I'm not totally sure where the basket and the shadow ends, but it does belong there. Same with this little guy right in here. Bring that up. So now we have an outlined map of all of the highlights and midtones in this. So if I were, go ahead.
Is this demo going to be posted on Canvas? Because
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, dear. Okay, so now we have a totally broken apart piece of this painting. So now I'm going to show you what this looks like without the layers. So let's go ahead and I'm going to remove my photo layer. Oh crap, I drew on the wrong goddamn layer again. I literally made a second layer to not do that and did it wrong. Well, you can see it pretty well. It would be in black. So I'll do another section real quick. So you see how I went about doing that. If it helps you to do it in different colors as a start, you absolutely can. I would never tell someone that they can't do it in a certain method that's going to make it easier to see. Honestly, it had never occurred to me to do it in colors until I was doing this on a screen for somebody. So if we were to do this little area down here with all the cloth on it, I'm going to go to layer 2 now, like a responsible adult. And I'm going to go ahead and pull a different color to start my outlines here, just so we can see it. Let's do a bright blue. Okay. Sorry, it's almost shocking me. All right, so I am going to now circle my light areas on this. So we're dealing with a different set of values here, yes? Like we are looking at something that is white. So the white highlight here is going to be our gauge for what the lightest portion of this is. And obviously there's a lot of white in here, but you'll also notice that there are big chunky areas where you can tell there are darker spots. So I'm going to go ahead and outline my white area here. So here is the edge of the top of this tablecloth, and I've got this kind of funky little spot here where you can see all the folds in everything. So there's my first white section. I'm going to go ahead and do a bunch of the white sections in here. So I'm going to be as detailed as possible, going around these little spots down here where it's a little chunkier. You notice how I'm leaving some areas in here where it's clearly not white. So I've got that large section in here. It's going to come down to the bottom. So as of right now, I am just doing the highlights, partially because there is so much white here. It is definitely probably the easiest way to do it. Let's see. So in this part of the tablecloth, that's a little white section that comes up there. There's a little darker section that's right next door. So I'm going to leave that off. There's a little light section right here, but you can see how I left a line between these two guys because there is a dark space there. The better your map is for this, the better your final project will come out.
Miss Crow.
Yes, dear.
But when we do this, we'll all just do it in just black and just a black.
Yes.
All right.
You know, if I will tell you that if it is easier for you to do it using color first, you may, but you need to be able to go over it with a Sharpie because you need it to bleed through the page.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So if you wanted to do a portion of this, like let's say using a colored pen, you could, but you're going to have to go back over it with Sharpie to be able to see it. Part of the reason that that's important is really just to make sure you didn't miss anything. But I find that using color on something like this, part of the reason I do it is because I don't have a piece of paper that I can just check.
Okay.
Whenever I do these in person, usually you'd actually watch me do one of these on a piece of paper, is I would look at the front and then I'll just flip it over and look at the back to make sure I got what I'm looking for.
Okay. So it
I
is
just a much more analog version of doing this
Spence,
thing.
you end up having a sheet that looks like this. And since it's
Flip over
so
the back too.
yeah, so on the back you can actually see all the work that I put in, but
cool.
otherwise
Is
just
it
staring
all
at the
reversed, or am I like insane?
It's reversed when you are looking at the back of it, but we are not transferring it in reverse.
Okay, cool.
So
Yeah,
your
you just
final work will not be reversed.
Yeah,
but
because you're gonna reverse it again
yes.
when you. All right, cool. Thank you.
Okay, so almost through my highest highlights here. Okay, that looks pretty good. The edge is really bright, so I'm going to put that back in. Okay, so there's a good section of highlights from there, but now I'm going to go in and actually add my midtones. So I'm going to use a slightly darker blue here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and outline the midtone there. And these can double over. Actually, I think in some ways you doing these with just black is probably a little simpler because you do get to just see the edge of the outline. All of that is what I would consider to be a midtone. That's another one. That's quite a bit darker. There's a midtone right here. There's another one right here. There's another one here. There is a black space in between that. There's another midtone right here on this apple. This guy is also a midtone. This is a midtone. Okay, and this little section right here is a midtone. This is a midtone. And now we're going to go ahead and go in and outline the black. So I am going to choose I'm going to choose a brighter color here. I think I'll do a green. Okay, and so our black areas in here are then going to be this section here. And some of them may be very tiny, but this is what gives the image depth. Here, we've got this little duty here. And sometimes like with a color that's like say 90% dark, you can decide to count it as being a little darker than it is. You can decide to include it with black. You can decide to round up with it too. So there is some actual decision making that goes into what you're going to include in certain places and what you're not. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get the rest of this little guy down here. Okay, so there's my other really dark spot. Go ahead and bring that up. Like I said, I want you to be more detailed than this, but trackpad. Okay, and then I've got this little black area right here that needs to be outlined. I've got this little guy right here. Got this little piece here. There's a little black strip right in there. This little section here is dark. Okay, so that's a pretty good map to start off with in there. So if I were to go ahead and remove my previous layer on this, what you see is this. So that'll be what you see through the back of it. But surprisingly, looks a whole goddamn like what it actually is, right? Like it looks like folded up stuff with apples sitting on it. I mean, so the better your map is, the better off you will do with this. So you once you have, I mean, clearly you've all chosen your image. But once you have finished your pattern tests and your pen tests, then you can actually print out your image once I send it to you. So I will be sending files this afternoon. You can print out your image and begin working on it using either, if you feel more comfortable using colored pencil or pencil ahead of time, and then using Sharpie later, you may. But going in and actually beginning to break down the image into the different shadow specific Dali painting, and it just will not work for the project. There is just way too much empty space in it. And so that one I had him choose a different Dali image and it worked out. But there are sometimes ones where I'll be like, yeah, this isn't going to work. Like there's too much black, there's too much white, there's too much dead space. Like sometimes there are places you do need a certain type of painting structure to do this project. That makes sense to everybody. Okay. So everyone needs to email me their top 5 paintings that they would like to use for this. And I am going to show you what your next step is. So I actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out how I was going to show this to you guys. Because usually what I would do is I would actually sit in front of you with a printout. And I would do this by hand in front of you. In this case, obviously that's not going to happen. So I'm going to do it in Photoshop so you guys can see my screen as I do it. But I do want to show you again the physical copy I have. So everyone is going, once you have an image, you're going to print it out. So I will give you some notes about how you print things, but you want to print it in black and white. And I know that many of you are like, but I have color printers. Why would I print it in black and white? I will show you because it makes a really, really big difference when you're actually doing this project. So this one is Eric Sina's from a few years ago. You see he has outlined traced around very meticulously all of the highlights, the lowlights, and the mass in the painting. It then shows through the back, so you can actually check your work just by flipping it over and looking through it. You do want to be doing this with a fine point Sharpie or an extra fine point Sharpie. And it's really so you can check that you got everything, because this is going to get transferred onto another page. So I'm going to do the digital equivalent of this for you today. Any questions for me so far? Is everyone okay? Okay. All right, so I am going to use this one because no one in any class has chosen this painting yet. So this is one of Cezanne's apple paintings. It's also frequently cited as one of the first Cubist works because the space in here is just totally imaginary. But so when you print an image, first of all, I just want to go over this. If you're looking at something in preview and you go to print, first of all, you do want to print into grayscale, but the other big one is you want to scale to fit and print entire image. Those are two things you want to do when you print this, because it will change the scale of the painting a little bit. But scale to fit and print entire image. You don't just want to scale it up, and you don't just want to fill the entire page, because then it actually changes the image. You want to print the whole thing. Just saying. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take this painting and put it into Photoshop, and we're going to start breaking it apart into sections. So when we're doing this, yes, I don't care that I'm putting it in an RGB space. All right. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this. So there's my painting. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and black and white this. And I know you're probably wondering why. So I will tell you, and I know it's a little hard to see where my mouse is on here, but let's see if I can find something that'll show you. Okay, so now I've got my big circle. I'm not going to do anything with the big circle, but big circle. Okay, so if you look at the yellow in the apples here, the yellow in the apples here, and then the yellow in the apples here, most people will tell you that they are 3 different colors. They're not. they're all the same color. And it has to do with what's around them as to why you see them as being brighter or darker. So for instance, the yellows in this area right here, those yellows, since they are next to a much darker color, and there is predominantly more yellow in what they're around, so you're going to read them as lighter, are going to look brighter than say the yellow marks on here. And that's also because yellow is in the same color family as green. So they actually don't have the same sort of vibration between the two colors. We'll talk a little more about this when we talk about color theory. But it is very important that we differentiate here between color and value. So value has to do with how bright something is or how much gray is in it. So the easiest way to do this, and I've already said it, is to use it in black and white. So that is the reason that I'm having you print these in black and white, because now all of a sudden when this is in black and white, it's really apparent that this yellow, and this yellow are all the same color. Because this is going to do more with, this is going to have a lot more to do with values than with other stuff. Like color differentiation is a totally different thing, especially in painting. Okay, let me add a new layer here. I'm actually going to do this the right way today because I screwed this up yesterday. All right, so I'm going to be doing my sketch layer on top of this, and I am going to be using a different color for this so you can see it. Anyone feeling a certain color today? Otherwise,
Purple.
purple?
Yellow.
Purple and yellow are my two ones. Okay, I'll use purple and yellow. I will use yellow for the highlights and I will use purple for the lowlights. How does that sound?
Great.
Okay, let's make a nice yellow. All right. It's a little muddy. Let's go in and actually select a color value. There we go. Okay. So I have my color selected for going into this. It's just going to help you see a little bit, but usually, so you guys will be doing this on a physical piece of paper in black Sharpie, but I am going to be doing this on here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom into this area here, and we're going to start by outlining the highlights. So a highlight is the lightest area on something. So the place I'm going to start is going to be right in here. And I apologize, guys, I am doing this on a trackpad. So if I'm not like the most accurate person, please forgive me. So I'm going to go ahead and trace all of these little highlights on these apples. So there is a difference in the tone here. So these are this area, all the areas that I'm circling. Well, I'm not really circling. I'm tracing them at this point. Are about the same value. And so they are the bright spots on these apples. So looking at color, yeah, I mean, I've got this little dude here who's really bright. Got another little spot right here. And guys, I will tell you that the better, the more meticulous you are with this step, the better off you will be later. I know this feels like it might be tedious, and it can be very tedious at this stage. The better your map is going into the next step, the better the final product comes out. People who spend a lot of time on this step, I know it feels like it is something it looks like you could rush through. Really, you shouldn't. It yields such a better, actually, I'll give you a couple examples at the end with student work, but it makes such a difference if you actually take your time on these. Okay, what's a third color I can use, guys, for a mid-tone?
Lavender.
Lavender. Well, I was going to do purple for the other one. Do you want me to do like a magenta?
Sure.
Okay, magenta it is. All right, so guys, this is for the midtone. So I have right now, the things that I have highlighted on here are the lightest areas on, and I'm just gonna do the fruit basket for now. I will do a little bit of the sheet here in a sec, but so now I'm going for the middle areas. So those mid-tone areas are areas that are not black and not super light. They're your mid-tone gray. So there is a decent amount of mid-tone gray in here. Then I'm going to go ahead and outline. But you'll also notice that there is a lot of black in this painting, and there is a lot of black around these apples. And that black is actually going to stay a singular mass because our brains will be able to read it as separate objects, even if we don't fill it in. And I will be posting this, guys. I'm actually going to post a compilation of all 4 times that I have done this, because all of them, I've used the same painting every time, and I've done this a little differently every single time because I am not a robot. Speaking of, I've been watching Westworld, and it's amazing for those of you who have not watched it. Okay, so there is my mid-tone value. And we have a little dark value in there. That's the edge of another piece of apple. Got another one here. Obviously, guys, you won't be doing this in color. I mean, if you would like to draw it in color, you can. You do need to go over the thing you do with Sharpie regardless, because you really need it to bleed through the page so you can double check your work. Okay. And all of these guys back here, I'm going to consider to be the same value. So I will tell you that an area like this, like, yes, I see that there's some little highlights in here. They're not exactly necessary to what's going on in the rest of the painting. So for me, I'm not going to stress out about being super detailed about those. You can make visual choices with these. So for instance, you'll notice that I'm gonna make some broad sweeps on the back, on the black in this basket, because in fact, you don't need every little bit of information here. Okay, so there is my outline of my apples. And I am now going to go to a dark purple for the last little piece. Okay, so for the black section, so now I'm going to go ahead and outline my blacks. And a lot of this is going to just be single value, and that's totally allowed. But right in here, you'll notice that there's this very dark edge to the top of the basket here that kind of runs along it with this nice light spot in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that we say that that light spot differentiates from the darkest areas in the basket. And we also have a light spot in here that I'm just going to go ahead and block off because I don't want it to be part of my super dark part of my basket. And bring that back around. This edge over here. Okay, this little guy is going to come like that. And it'll come up to there. All right, the rest of that looks pretty damn black to me. But when you look at all of these areas now, you'll notice that I have a lot of space between this purple where I have decided that it's just going to stay black. There is a line between the basket and the wine bottle here. I'm putting that in because visually it does not make sense without it. So there we go. We have our outline of our basket here. This edge ends right like that. Okay, so what happens now if I get rid of some of the lines I've made? So there's my little outline. And I'm just going to drop my previous layer out from behind so you can see it. So if I flipped over the page, that's what it would look like. And it actually looks quite a bit like what it is, and it's intended to. So what will happen is that then, so there's my original, there's my drawing. So in all of these, what'll happen is that you can choose patterns so patterns will end up going into this once you've transferred this onto another page. So if I were to be transferring this onto another page, it would look like a line drawing like this, and I would be choosing patterns to go in each one of these. Now, I will tell you that there's a trick to this, which is that let's say I have these little highlights here on my apples. If I make all the highlights the same pattern and all the apples the same pattern, so that would mean that these backgrounds would be the same for every single one with a black outline, and then all of the highlights would be the same pattern. You can consistently mimic the space that exists in this using pattern as density. So I know that feels like a lot, but I do want to show you some examples. So like for instance, this is Santi's from a few years ago. I know you saw this the other day, but he chose different densities of line according to how dark or light the shadow was. So for instance, if you had highlights, yeah, I guess you could choose to reverse it and make the highlights the darkest area, but you do have to keep in mind that it is going to draw focus. You'll notice that when, you know, little changes and things like this, where someone has actually shaded the shadow around it and used the same pattern for something. So like the dots on the skirt are the same. It's just that he's then put extra shading into areas where there is a shadow so that it can actually show dimension. And as a for instance, so if we look at something like this one, you can tell that this person's drawing just was not as accurate as other people's. The piece itself came out quite nice. It's really austere. But in terms of effort, it doesn't read as though he put a ton of effort into it. It did come out nice. I'm not gonna, like, it did, he got a good grade, but it definitely, it's like a solid B plus. Like it's a lackluster piece, where when you look at something like this is really, really dense and really beautiful, but you'll notice that the more detailed the drawing that you start off with, the better you have to be able to go in and really kind of go wild with pattern on stuff. So like some people do make visual choices, like where he kept the tiger stripes on the tiger. That makes a whole lot of sense to me. I had someone one year make this into a robot tiger, and it was actually really cool. So I mean, this is, as they say, your party. It is yours to have fun with. I mean, and then you can have something like this, which is hyper dense. And yes, all of those patterns do layer correctly, but I mean, the amount of detail in each one of these is actually, this thing kind of hurts to look at. It's beautiful, but it does kind of hurt to look at. So there are lots of things that you can do with these little divisions that you're going to make. Yeah, Nick, what's up?
I was just thinking, since I'm doing a hokusai painting, it doesn't really have dimension to it.
It doesn't, but Hokusai definitely deals with breaking down space. So, I mean, actually, I'm very interested to see what you do with a Hokusai for this reason. But if you look at the way all Asian art is put together, it's their version of depth is essentially they take the front to back landscape plane. So, like if we were looking towards a horizon line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they condense it, so they flatten it forward. So what you want to make sure that you get between that, because there is shading in them. It's not totally dimensionless, whether or not it's done with mark making. There are a lot of options for you. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that if you have, you know, this plane that's, you know, supposed to be moving away from you, that's been flattened forward into a flat space, always remember that the first little chunk on the bottom, because they're kind of layered, right? Like cake.
Yeah.
Always remember that the first one closest is the one that is closest to you. And you can mimic depth in it easily.
Okay.
I mean, it'll take some experimentation. I'm not saying that, like, these are funny because when you're confronted with having to use a masterwork for something, you kind of don't want to fuck it up because it's a masterwork, right? Like there is a little bit of pressure there. I understand that. But looking at the way they construct space is actually the reason we do this assignment, is because it does actually help you understand how to put something together that works well visually. It's going to be a bit of trial and error for you. I think, and that's okay. I actually think this project is mostly trial and error, and it's if you go into this with the mindset of being a really well thought out doodle, and I know those things too kind of contradict each other, but if you go in with the idea that it's going to be a really well thought out doodle, meaning that you have some plans when you go in, typically if once you fill in one thing, it'll give you the freedom to respond to what you've done. And that's a process I can't really explain until you've started it. But like, let's say I'm going to pull one of these out because there are some very interesting choices that get made in these. So as a matter of this, like, I love this one. I absolutely love this one. But so he started with the tiger stripe on here. And I think so he started with the tiger stripes, and it looked really good. And then he started filling in all these really wild patterns around it, and it got way too busy really quick. And so we kind of had to rein this one back in. So a lot of the line width and the places that got filled in all happened last, which is kind of like, if you start one place, you just sort of like, oh, well, that makes it look really heavy, or that makes it look like it doesn't sit correctly. And then being like, well, how do I undo that? And then, oh, well, maybe I put a black shadow behind it, or maybe I make the person who's riding the tiger a little darker. So it is a very push and pull kind of process to put one of these together. But for you specifically, always remember the first thing closest to you is the closest object. So therefore it is going to be the lightest in terms of color. Also with Hokusai, he does use a lot of marks to indicate depth that are like wood cutting marks. There is no reason that you cannot incorporate that as a pattern, if that helps.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, guys, so I'm going to do one more little section of this really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and do the this little largely white area actually with this tablecloth, and I'm going to do this complicated section over here. Any questions on how I'm going about doing this? Is it kind of clear to everybody what I'm doing? All right. I'm going to take your silence as a yes. Okay, I'm going to do my highlights here with this super bright aqua because I love this color. So in this case, most of my space is white. So I'm actually going to start with the white here. So this one, and keep in mind when you're doing fabrics, the little like bunchy spots in fabric are actually pretty angular. But there's a decent amount of like little gray sections in this thing that I have to cover because it's it is, actually a folded object. Okay, so there's that one. And I'm going to go and start this complicated section up here. All right, so you notice that I'm basically just outlining when I come into these areas where I know there's like a gray area coming up to it, and I just outline the area that I want in the one value. I mean, obviously, I know you guys will be doing this with a singular color with the extra fine point Sharpie, but this I would go about this exactly the same way, which is that I'm going to leave little spaces between these because there are spaces in between these that indicate folds. And I know that many of you are like, but Ms. Grau, I don't see a value change there. I promise that if you look, value changes are actually something you just get used to seeing. Another reason I always kind of tend to do this in black and white is because it never fails that teaching at a boys' school, I have at least one person who's colorblind every year. And black and white value makes this a lot simpler. Okay. And I've got one little last bright section in here. Okay, and now I have gray values that I need to deal with. Actually, that's one more little white section in there. Okay, so I'm going to go to a slightly darker color. Let's go to a bright green. And I'm going to do the mid values. So here are my mid values in here. There's a large amount of mid value in there. There's a little one that runs in there. Little edge here. I'm going to re-outline that because I was going around it. Most of these are going to look like they're going to be blackish. Also, don't underestimate how much work your brain can do to actually make sense of this stuff. I will tell you that like a lot of this is really, once you have shapes and you add patterns into them, most of us will still be able to recognize the painting without fail. One little gray area in here. And then I'll go in and I'll add my blacks last. There aren't a ton of grays in here because it is a majority white spot on this painting. But that whole section is a gray value, as is this one here. And this little guy down here. Okay. All right, and I'm gonna go ahead and do my black value now, and I'm gonna go ahead and make that a, I don't know, we'll do dark blue. Okay, and here are my black values. So you'll notice that I left a little line here so that I could get above the orange there. I'm doing that for your case visually because if you're just outlining an area, that'll happen much more naturally. I'm doing it just so you can see that like there are black edges sometimes on things that are really important. And also you can vary your line width for outlines on this. So that is an option as we go along, that if you need something to really be emphasized, you can actually outline it in a thicker outline than other things in the painting. Doesn't always work, but it does work typically if you need to focus a painting onto something. Okay, and there are the remainder of my black values in that space. I don't think I missed anything. I mean, outside, I guess I didn't get this orange over here, but I'm not going to go back and do that right now. All right, so there's another little section of it, so you can see the beginnings of that. So again, I'm going to drop my back layer. There's my map. It actually looks remarkably like what it is. So you can see what those two things are. So you can see the outlines of the low lights, so the shadows, the highlights, or I guess highlights are highlights, the bright spots, and the midtones. And so when you create patterns for these, you can use almost anything. I've had people do really strange things with patterns before. I actually had someone use cursive script as pattern one year in this painting specifically. And inside every apple, because there are oranges in this too, the pattern that he used was he wrote circularly in them. And it said like apple, 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 apple over and over and over again. But they were just connected script that he did. The making pattern is any repeated element. And I have given you tons and tons of little places to look for that in that pattern test thing. So there are many, many options on how you look at pattern and and all the different types of patterns you can use. Pattern is a very open concept. If you ever have a question about using something, I mean, just ask. Also keep in mind that black and white are both acceptable for certain areas. So for instance, if I decided that like the focal point of this piece was actually this, white area in the front, which I mean, I think it is, you could decide to leave the napkin white. I don't think it's going to work, but it might be the last thing that you add pattern to because it is the most important thing, or it might be the thing that you start with and then you respond to it. All of that kind of stuff is up to you. Does anyone have any questions about that stuff, guys? Yeah, Carson, what's up?
When we trace in Sharpie, are we looking to do it onto another sheet of paper or onto the back?
Well, actually, neither. You're going to trace onto the front. So you draw onto the front so that you can see what you're doing. And then the way you check, so like where I'm dropping this layer behind because I'm using colors, your version of that is extremely analog, which is that you can flip over the page and see if you missed anything. But when this gets transferred, it is going to be right reading. We are not going to flip it around. So you want to be doing the tracing on the front of the image. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. We are going to go ahead and take this Cezanne. So I've already copied and pasted this particular image into Photoshop and black and whited it. So when you print your image, so I'm going to just fake print this here. So when you print your image, so you are going to need a printed copy. You do want to print it in black and white. The other setting you want to make sure is on here is you want to hit scale to fit and print entire image. So if it is just to scale, so at 100% scale, it's going to be a little bit small or it's going to be a little bit large usually. So you want to scale it to fit the page and make sure the entire image is being printed. If you do fill entire paper, you tend to lose pieces of whatever you're doing. So make sure you are hitting print entire image. And it does need to be printed in black and white. And I bet you're wondering why black and white, right? We have color printers. So I'm going to point out some stuff on here. So if you look at, say, the yellow color that is right here, 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 and on these little buns over here and here, within the context of this painting, like looking at this painting as it is right now in color, many people would tell you that all those values are different. They're not. They're all the same color. It's just that they look very different when they are next to other things. This is something we will start to cover a lot more in depth with color theory. But whenever you have whenever you have colors next to certain things, those things will influence it. So for instance, if we have this yellow in here that is next to this very bright orange red, it is going to look more vibrant and lighter than it will when it's on a more like color family, like the green. There's also a reason that the green and the red fruit looks brighter when they are next to each other, and it's because they are complementary colors. So the reason we are black and whiting these has little to do with printers and much to do with how you make decisions about value in these. So I have one in here that has been, so I have gone ahead and black and whited this, so I desaturated it. Because now what you can see is if we go to these same spots, I'm going to use a much larger tool here so you can see my big circle. But if you look here and here and here and here and here, all of a sudden you're aware that all of those things have the same value or the same level of darkness or lightness. That is what value means. And so you can make differing decisions about how this work goes together with that. Okay, so how, pray, do we break this down? So I'm going to go ahead and do this here instead of on. So usually what I would do is I would be sitting at a table in front of you and I would draw on one of these using an extra fine point Sharpie, and you would actually see me break this down in person. We're not going to do that. I'm actually going to do that on Photoshop. So I have a couple of examples here. So this is an outline that I have left from a student. So this is Eric Sinas from a few years ago. But so what you do is you take your extra fine point Sharpie and you are going to trace around very detailed. So you always want to be detailed with this. You're going to trace around the shadows, the highlights, and the maps in these. So usually what those can be broken down to is midtones, highlights, and lowlights. So you want to be relatively detailed about this because it does, the more detailed you are, the better the piece comes out in the end. And the reason we are using the extra fine point Sharpie is because you have this very analog way of checking whether or not you got everything and whether or not it looks right. Is that you can, as you are drawing, be doing something on the front and go, okay, I'm going to flip to the back of the page and double check that everything looks correct. If it looks correct, you can then gauge that your drawing is actually doing its job in terms of breaking down space. So you guys will be doing this the analog way, which is that it will be printed out and you will use an extra fine point Sharpie on the front. I obviously, you watching me do that on Zoom is idiotic because you wouldn't be able to see. It is detailed enough that you just wouldn't be able to see it. So I am going to go ahead and break apart some space on this painting here with you in Photoshop. And I will show you, I will remind you of examples at the end. Pick a color, guys. What do you want me to outline with for my highlights?
Red.
Red? Do we want pink or red? What are we feeling?
Red.
Pink.
Red. All right.
Refine red.
Okay, we will go with a nice bright ass vermilion. All right, so I am going to start in this area here. So we've got this lovely little basket and we've got this little tablecloth here. So I am going to start using the highlights in the fruit. So I'm going to zoom way in just so you guys can see it. So you want to be really detailed when you do this. So I'm going to go ahead and trace around the highlights on these apples. So this painting contains both apples and oranges, but it's apples that are in the basket. And so I am going for the lightest value in this area right now. And it's generally going to be on most everything. I know painters sometimes will leave little sections off because they're actually painting from what they are seeing in life. Okay, those guys are all about the same value. There's also this little dude right in here that I'm going to go ahead and include, and this funky little lump right there. Yeah, you know, there's a nice little bright spot back here. I'm going to go ahead and get that in there just for depth. Yeah, there's a little bit of a light section right on top of this edge of the fruit. Okay, so there are my highlights. So those are the lightest spots on those. So pick another color. What do you want for my midtones?
Orange,
Orange?
for sure.
Alrighty. So I'm going to use a nice pumpkin-y orange here. So now I'm going to go ahead and outline my midtones. So midtones are when they are in the middle. And yes, you can have more than one midtone. You can also make decisions about your midtones on what to include and what not to include. In many ways, this is your party. And there are parts of this that comes down to how you see and what you decide to include and not include. So for instance, in the fruit, I would tell you that most of this is just going to be one single midtone along with a dark area and a light area. But there are people who have done this who have been much more detailed about it even than me and found multiple midtone values or differentiated between the midtone values on, say, the oranges versus the apples, according to how they're filled in with pattern. So there are my midtones, and that's generally going to encompass most, but you'll notice I'm leaving some of these edges here where it starts to get really dark because in fact, those reed is generally kind of black. I mean, a huge amount of these fruits are fading into the background, right? Like they really aren't super duper solid on the front. It's not like we're seeing the entirety of them. We're actually seeing a portion of them. I mean, like there are edges here where they are actually fading into the shadow in the basket behind them. And that is something you don't want to lose. And you'll notice a lot of times I leave little lines in between things. Since you guys are doing this with a singular color, it's going to look a little bit different where you don't have to do some of the gyrations that I'm doing where I'm like circling the whole thing. And I'm doing that for your benefit so that you can see the differences between the two spaces. But with a black pen, there will be areas that you just decide, well, no, you know what? That's black. Like I don't need to put anything there, or I'm going to make all the black spaces one pattern, which is also a totally valid approach to this. Okay, this top part's going to be a little bit of a midtone there. There's another one here. Okay, so there are the midtones in the fruits. So now what color should I use for my black value?
Green.
Green. Oh, interesting choice.
Yes.
I'm going to go with a bright green here. Is that the type of green you were thinking?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and outline my black values now. So I'm actually going to start way over here to the side because we're going to address the big elephant in this room, which is that a huge portion of this basket is essentially black. So this edge comes down and there's this little shadow here that connects to the bottom, and that is also going to be black. And there's a little black edge that comes along here, but you'll notice that there's a big midtone gray value down here that I'm actually not outlining with green because it's part of something else. So there's one of my black values. And then this piece is going to come all the way around here. And it's got this nice black edge. And there is a differentiating line between the basket and the bottle. I know it's not super obvious, but that is one of those that you want to include, where I'd tell you that an artistic liberty is able to be taken there because you really want this to sit in front of the bottle, because it actually is in front of the bottle within the painting. Let's see, this piece actually comes back a little bit further because you can see that light section in there. And then let's see, most of the rest of this is going to, all right, there is this nice little edge here on the basket where it's nice and dark. And then it comes down to a black value here. And then we've got, so now there's this black value that sits all between everything in here, which is that these are large spaces that can essentially be one color, right? Because in terms of how space is organized in this painting, they're all kind of connected. I apologize for my messy lines here. I am using a trackpad for this. Okay, there's another black space in there. Comes out to there. And I will, in a sec, I will get rid of the image behind this so you can see what these look like. Okay, go around this area. All right. And my last little fruit here. There we go. Okay, so I mean, there are some little tiny black spaces in here too, if you want to include them. Little one right in there. Okay, so there's a really good outline. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and remove my back layer. So there's what that actually looks like. It looks surprisingly like exactly what it is, which is a basket filled with apples. And so the goal is that you are breaking these down to where space still makes sense, even though it's just a line drawing. So when you circle these things, what's going to happen is now each one of these spaces will get filled with a pattern. Now there's a lot of repeated elements in most paintings. A painting like this, especially, there are tons of repeated elements because it's still life, right? There's tons of different types of fruits here. So maybe when I am doing this, I decide that I want all of the highlights on here to be filled with dots. And maybe I decide that I want all the midtones to be filled with stripes. And then maybe I decide that I want all of the blacks to look like a basket woven texture. And so I actually use dots in all my highlights here, but then maybe I take that element from inside the basket and I actually put it into the other fruit that's in here, so that then consistently all the fruit highlights have dots on them. Or all the fruit lowlights have basket texture, or all of the fruit midtones have stripes. You know, if you do something like that, and so you can make some choices which essentially organizes space very similarly to how a painting is put together, which is that your brain will then read them as being the same thing. Now, as an example of that, let's see, which one do I want to pull? So for instance, a piece like this, so this is the two Fridas, you'll notice that in the shadow areas down here, he's used the same pattern in the shadow area that he has in the rest of the dress, and he just decided to actually add shading so that it indicates that it is a different space. It exists in a different plane. It fades behind things. So you want to maintain how the painting acts. So I tell you that in a lot of cases, the highlights as they read in a painting are probably going to be want to be filled with a less dense pattern than the shadows. You can reverse them, but it would be a problem for you to work with. And I mean that in a good way. Problem solving is fun. This is basically the most intelligent doodle you'll ever do, which I know I've said that. But as you add pattern to this, you are going to react and make choices to each pattern you make. So for instance, I'm trying to remember where he started this one, because I believe it was this pattern in her dress which happens to be a very overwhelming pattern. So as soon as he put that down, I mean, I remember when he colored this thing in, he was like, oh shit, I think I made a mistake, because it was so loud. And then it was, well, how do I counteract that? Okay, so I need a pattern on this dress that can stand up to this dress. So then he came up with this Aztec pattern. Okay, I have a very dark hem here. I need a hem here that's going to call attention to it. Oh, okay, well, I put patterning in the hair here, and patterning, what kind of patterning do I want to match in the hair on the other side? Do I want information in the faces? And in his case, that's the one portion of this that's blank. But I remember when he got to the end of this and he still had these cloud drawings in the back, and he's like, I have no idea what to do. And it's like, well, why don't you put something super simple, like straight lines in it, just so, yeah, it has mass, it works in the composition, but it's also not distracting from the fact that you have all of this gorgeous pattern in here. Holy damn, if those had actually had pattern in them, it wouldn't have worked. So that's those solutions get made and those decisions get made as you are making it, which sometimes means that you need to set it up and walk away from it and look at it and decide, oh, well, that looks wrong. Or, hey, maybe this section needs work. Or if something feels off, you take a picture of it, you send it to me and say, hey, Miss Grau, why does this look weird? And chances are I can tell you. But so the way you make those decisions, you can approach it much more like this person, which is he approached this very, very methodically. And he started by coloring in black areas specifically. He decided specifically what he wanted to be black at the beginning and then added pattern around that. Or you can have one like this, where someone, his main decision was that he wanted the tiger print on the tiger. But let me tell you, tiger print is a big thing to fight. It is a loud pattern. So how do we balance the rest of this, which is already a busy ass painting? How do we balance the rest of this by adding other stuff? And so it's, okay, well, I put this down. And then I think he put in the stripes on the man to make them kind of blend together. And that's a big thing to have real front and center. But then to come in with more bold patterns that are going to counterbalance that, where you're still not going to lose that tiger at the same time, it definitely is a working back and forth between those things. I mean, I think the end to this one that really brought it together is the tiger has a slightly wider outline on it than the other figures in the painting. You can also opt for simplicity, though I will tell you that looking at this one, this person did not do a particularly good trace of their original image. You look at it and it's definitely a little haphazard in some places, and it's simplistic. The actual composition came out very nice. Like I'd say this was a solid, B plus. I mean, it's not like he did amazing, but it is a very, very, very nice. It is a very nice drawing, actually. And it's because he did care for it as he filled it in. But his actual trace was definitely a little lackluster. You can also go the other direction, which is that then you have someone who is totally insane about the type of trace that they do. I mean, the amount of detail included in this work is just incredible. And even his choices in terms of shadow and light and all kinds of things are really, really stunning. But he included tons of detail. There is a happy medium there. I tend to prefer working with more to start off with and then deciding to leave things out later. So this is going to be your next step, which is that you're going to print your image in black and white, and then you are going to actually start piecing it together in terms of, going through with your Sharpie and dealing with pulling out the highlights, the lowlights, and the mask, because we want it to maintain its paintingness. Now, I will tell you that if we were dealing with a painting like this, you do want to include color shifts in the background, at least in your initial trace. You might not necessarily leave them in the later piece, but you do want that information there. Does anyone want me to do a little bit more, or is everyone good? Speak now or forever hold your peace, gentlemen.